Well, I hope you can hear me. Thank you very much for this very warm welcome. And I'd very much like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, past and present, and thank you for that welcome. It's a great privilege to be here in Montreal, and especially to meet Anna and to meet all the team that's made this event a reality. It's going to be a very exciting 2 days for myself and for Ethan Miller, who is also a member of the Community Economies Collective, and we represent a group of about 30 people now who are part of that collective. And so we're very happy to be here. We're sorry that some of the others from other parts of the world can't join us. I know some of them have produced little short videos that may be accessible to some of you. The economic experimentation that's been taking place in Quebec over the last 20 or so years has always been an inspiration for J.K. Gibson Graham and for the Community Economies Collective. So I'm really looking forward to hearing throughout the day about how you are continuing to put a post-capitalist politics into practice in so many ways. And I guess I need to explain why I see what you're doing as producing a post-capitalist politics. I've had interesting relationships across Canada with different groups. I've been invited a few times to Victoria University and the Centre for Cooperative and Community Economies there, which I remember. I realised I brought this scarf with me, not knowing that it actually came from Canada. And that's a wonderful at the other end of this country, group that is also interested in these issues. And I know that my colleague Phil Kelly at York University in Toronto has been using Take Back the Economy in his teaching. So I feel like this is great to kind of be slowly moving across the country and getting to Montreal and back to Quebec, which has, actually, as I said, inspired us in so many ways. So I just want to thank again Anna and all the team for this very hard work of translating our work into French and opening it up to a new audience to some extent in Quebec. And for organising this very exciting event. So, I'm hoping that this last book, or this most recent book from the Community Economies Collective that I want to discuss now will be helpful to your projects, and I'm interested to hear your reactions and responses to what I say now. So now, let me just figure out the technology. Oh, and by the way, I just wanted to acknowledge the nature of Montreal. I had to waddle along, avoiding all the ice patches this morning, realising that nature does, talk to us in some ways. And I kept remembering our poor Australian ambassador, the one before the one that's just there now in the US, who on his very first day of office in Washington walked out the steps of his house, fell over, broke his hip, and spent almost the rest of the year in traction. So I was keeping that in mind as I was slowly walking along, thinking, I don't want to end up in that space. So very nice, though, to be here and experiencing that little blast of winter still. Okay, so I want to talk about this book, Take Back the Economy, an ethical guide for transforming our communities, a book that was published by the University of Minnesota Press in 2013. And it was written with my dear colleagues Jenny Cameron and Stephen Healy, who are also members of the Community Economy Collective. And it was planned and started back in 2008, also with Julie Graham, who actually died in 2010. So Julie was part of the group that planned this book, and unfortunately didn't see the end of it, but the book is very much in tune with the work that she and I started many years ago. The book draws on our collective experience as geographers who were trained in political economy in the 70s, late 70s, early 80s, and it represents, I think, the most concerted attempt that we've made as yet to integrate a profound ecological sensibility into our rethinking of economy. And I don't think we go a long way in this direction, but it is an attempt to try and start to do this in a field that is very human-centred. So here we are responding to the challenges of what's been called the Anthropocene, and obviously there's critiques of that naming. But what we're really referring to is this new kind of geological era in which the Earth is being remade by urban, industrial, human action, which demands, I think, that we humans rethink ourselves as a species among other species living on this planet. So the book is, as Anna said, a kind of popular manual. It's written with groups of people in mind: students, teachers, communities, congregations, unions, and associations, reading and thinking and acting together. So, I mean, I'm very grateful for this opportunity we've marshalled here as a group to kind of engage with the ideas and see to what extent they are useful to you. It's informed by, and so it's designed to kind of, as I say, provoke ethical action for our times. What does that mean? It's informed by a range of theories, like anti-essentialist political economy, theories of performativity, theories of the new materialism, but it's written in an accessible style and abstract theoretical language is avoided. And I won't really be talking in that abstract language, but anyone that wants to kind of press me on where this thing has come from, I'm happy to talk about it, and Ethan would be too. Importantly, it doesn't lay down a blueprint. There's many groups, I think, at the moment who are laying down blueprints for the future. Instead, it presents what we call a set of thinking practices or techniques for making other worlds possible. How we use those techniques will have a lot of different outcomes. So in the lecture, I want to present some of these techniques, and I start with the technique of reframing, and then move on to some of the simple tools for trying to reorient ourselves to the ethical actions people are taking for people and the planet. So I kind of want to invite you to come along with me to join a thinking experiment and begin to observe the changes that might come from inventorying diverse economic practices and thinking and acting differently, and see what this kind of thinking and experimenting can provoke. So one of the premises of the book is that our current understanding of what constitutes an economy is standing in the way of responsibly facing the future and taking action to learn to live in our world in new ways that are less destructive of the very fabric of life as we've known it over the long interglacial summer, as Diane Dumonovsky calls it. So the take-back of the book obviously is borrowed from the catch cry of feminist marches in the 1970s and 80s, the catch cry to take back the night, so that it was safe for women to walk on the streets. And the take-back we refer to is one that demobilises the prevalent idea that the economy is somehow a kind of matter of fact, and a matter indeed of very closed facts that adequately somehow reflect reality and that operate together in known and predictable ways. So this is the kind of vision of economy that we're often presented with. This is the kind of machinic economy, usually called capitalism, which continues to be represented as the ultimate real. And this is despite the guerrilla attacks that J.K. Gibson Graham have been lodging for the last 20 years, or more than, 96, it's 20 years now. So, and here I put up the cover of the Turkish translation of our book, The End of Capitalism as We Knew It, a feminist critique of political economy. Because I think in a way it kind of really gets the idea. There we have the robot machine, the machinic economy gobbling up people, houses, livelihoods, gobbling up the planet. And there we have Julie and I, the kind of little Davids trying to lodge our slingshot, our little stones at the Goliath that is represented as this very really coherent system. So, we've been doing this for a while, but our metaphoric pebbles have not really destroyed this machinic economy. And I think it's now reasonably accepted that this machinic vision is built out of models of economy that have become models for economic behaviour, models that are moulded by metrics and technologies that actually perform national economies as large-scale economic experiments. We rarely talk about them as such because we see them as out there operating in a certain systematic, structured way. But this kind of vision has been constructed. Here's the National Monetary Income Analog Computer, built in 1949, which used water to model how money flowed around the UK economy and when government policy could and should intervene to kind of stop off or enable the flow. And here water was standing in for money. So actual concrete versions of this model were built, and there's an entertaining YouTube clip that demonstrates its working. This guy over here, there's one of these things still in Cambridge University, they're all over the world actually, showing how it works, with this little spigot turning, that little spigot, and this is how the system works. This kind of engineering hydraulic interaction that's built in was employed both Keynesian and neoliberal economic doctrine. Now, people like Michel Calon, Donald Mackenzie, Timothy Mitchell and others have shown how these economic doctrines have been used all over the world to then construct national economies. These theorists work on what we call the performativity of economics, synchronizes quite nicely with studies of biopower, the subject of Foucauldian governmentality studies. Biopower is seen as that particular form of power that's exerted over and through the life of populations via health practices, sexual regulation, medical paradigms, education systems, and so on. So in the economic realm, according to some, we're all governed by neoliberal capitalist biopower. Certainly we are enrolled in the experimental apparatus of business as usual, in laboratories that are set up to test consumer behaviour and decision-making under controlled settings, and in real-life sites, such as the current context in which models of the impact of, say, new carbon taxes on different groups are being tested and twisted and tweaked against public opinion, and the kind of calculative practices of energy providers and governments. So, in the economy as a machine, in that imaginary, we are confined to a very limited set of roles and a narrow set of motivations, where we are employees who somehow are motivated to get higher wages. We are entrepreneurs or business owners who want more profits and lower costs, especially wage costs. We're consumers who want more stuff for less price. We're property owners who want higher returns from their investments, and other sorts of investors who want greater private returns from our financial investments. So these are the kind of narrow economic roles that we are given in the kind of models of economy that have become mainstream and that are seen as the real. Up against this model, then, of economy and this model for economic behaviour, how can we even think of taking back the economy so that concern for well-being of ourselves and others and earth others is centre stage? The dominant representation of capitalism is so dominant with its encompassing power, its generalisable dynamics, its enlarged spaces of agency. As communities, we sort of cower in its presence. Well, this is where reframing as a technique of thinking and remaking the world comes in. So to reframe is to change our understanding, to refocus on different things, perhaps to foreground something that has been in the background. And obviously this slide shows the familiar figure-ground shift between seeing two faces looking at each other or seeing a flower vase, depending on the frame of reference. So for Julie and I, the most important reframing to have occurred over the last 100 years or so has been the one that's been brought about by the feminist movement. Feminism produced a very different discourse of what it was to be a woman. Feminism brought to light hidden histories or her stories of who holds up half the world. Feminism liberated women to take up many different roles, and it prompted a very different way of thinking about the world, one that put care and life and interconnection centre stage. So in the work that Julie and I did early on, the reframing offered by feminism informed our rethinking of economy. We said if feminists can reshape the world through this kind of reframing. How might we do that with the economy? So the feminist message is a hopeful one. It takes a step slightly beyond the Marxist adage that we understand the world in order to change it. And it tells us that changing our understanding is to change the world, if only partially and locally, because that changed understanding motivates different kinds of action. And I guess one of the things that we worked against was the way in which, in Marxian political economy, so many studies were, motivated by wanting to transform capitalism, but so much of the work was just studying how capitalism worked and actually shoring up the sense that this beast was very coherent and strong and always able to make itself malleable to deal with new sorts of crises and just come out on top again. So we were doing that kind of work as graduate students, and we finally realised that, hey, we don't want to make this thing stronger. We want to start making other realities stronger. So when we represent or represent the economy not as a machine-like entity, but as an outcome of everyday human actions, we're able to map out many ways that new practices of economy are emerging and can be strengthened. So in Take Back the Economy, we challenge the identity of the economy as inevitably capitalist. And we take back the economy for people and the planet by focusing on the ethical decisions that inform multiple economic dynamics. Each chapter takes a mainstream economic term, work, business, markets, property, finance, and takes it back by reframing it as a space of ethical decision, reclaiming it for a community economy, not a capitalist economy. So if the economy is not represented as a machine that operates in a kind of predictable way, with economists and policymakers pulling levers to control money supply or labour markets, then we can't set a course and expect that things will systematically unfold. And if our Earth isn't this kind of bottomless pit represented in this image, we can't keep feeding it to a machine to be gobbled up and spewed out. We must find other metaphors, other frames of meaning that inspire new ways of being and acting. And this is where, for us, the diverse economy reframing comes in. It widens the scope of what makes up our economy, that is, the identity of the economy, and opens up the discussion of what economic dynamics we might want to activate. So this is the kind of strategic thinking moves that we've taken and that are represented in this book. In our work with communities, instead of that are interested in different life-affirming development pathways, we've often used this image of the iceberg economy to help people see that they're all contributing to an economy that meets material needs and distributes well-being and wealth. So above the waterline, then, we see the activities that are usually represented or recognised as being part of the real economy. That is, waged labour, producing commodities for markets in capitalist businesses. But below the waterline, we see a mix of activities that are also necessary for survival or that produce well-being. Work in the home and the neighbourhood, production for use, not for exchange, other kinds of enterprises like cooperatives. Now, this image is an attempt to try and produce a figure ground shift for many, and for many people it works this way, who now see themselves as contributing to an economy, whereas before they saw themselves as marginal. And this is the kind of way in which it's introduced and used in the action research projects that we've been involved in. And of course, in different contexts, the iceberg takes a different form. This is the economy represented as a floating coconut in the work that we've done in the Pacific with communities where we thought using icebergs were perhaps less familiar. So here we have the kind of very few number of formal economic activities that many people in places like the Solomon Islands or Fiji are involved in, and the huge plethora of activities that everybody is involved in that are producing well-being, that are producing sustenance, that are supporting a community. And of course, we are very concerned about the kind of free trade policies that are trying to influence that top of the iceberg and change things, which will have huge ramifications for what goes on below the waterline in that floating coconut. In this case, we were using it to start to look at what would be community-based gender indicators of change. And so the activities get divided into who does what in terms of gender. So the diverse economy widens the scope of what makes up our economy. And here we draw on work in anthropology, on informal sector studies and sociology and development studies, studies of the cooperative movement and community activism and so on. And it gathers together this heterogeneous range of economic activities and arrays them in a kind of systematic framework rather than a jumble of activities as in the iceberg image. So we can kind of start to marshal those activities in a way that sort of aligns them more with the kind of traditional ways in which we think about economies. So here we really put them into columns pertaining to different kinds of economic practices. So along with the mainstream economic activities of waged labour, we could start to see waged labour of formal markets and capitalist enterprise. The diverse economy framing includes other forms of labour, other transactions, enterprises, and property and finance, including those in which relations are non-monetised and or are motivated by concerns that can't be reduced to rational competitive self-interest. So these are the ones particularly in that layering of alternatives. So let me just go through these columns and show you the kind of activities that we can marshal. So this is the top tip of the iceberg represented in terms of these columns. And we also, as I'll go on to show later on, we also add into this is the innovation of Take Back the Economy. We also add property and finance in here. And I guess the reason for laying out this inventory is that it invites us then to look at the complex interactions that take place within all these diverse economic practices and to start to experiment with different pathways that might be oriented towards the growth of well-being, rather than thinking that well-being can only be gained by getting a stake in the capitalist economy and getting into that kind of circuitous route of investment growth and so-called trickle-down effects. So in the growth machine, development is framed in terms of these higher wages, more profits, cheaper goods, private property, unregulated gambling of our finances. But we want to start to think of that differently. So first is just inventory and marshal all the different activities that are going on. So clearly, not only do we have paid labour in waged relationships, but people get alternative forms of payment as self-employed workers. They work reciprocal in terms of reciprocal labour exchange, particularly in agriculture around the world. And many people get paid in kind for their work, whether it's in-kind housing or food provision. Of course, there's also payment to people who are working for welfare, a different kind of wage in a way. But there's also the huge amount of unpaid labour that contributes to our living, our living economy. Housework, volunteering, self-provisioning, and slave labour. So the diverse economy inventory doesn't try and show things that we think are good. It's just showing all the things that are coexisting in the world. And I think there's a lot of research to show that slave labour is still very much part and parcel, particularly in the sex trade, but also child slave labour, particularly in many countries of the world. So this is an agnostic kind of inventorying going on at this point. So we have mainstream markets, but we also have other markets that are motivated by different kinds of ethics. Fair trade markets, alternative currencies, of course, underground markets and barter. And all the non-market transactions where money doesn't come into the transactional relationship, but there's still a transaction going on. Household sharing, gift giving, relations with nature through hunting and fishing, gleaning, the old practice that you might think as something that was, in biblical days where poor people were allowed into harvested fields to pick up what was left. But gleaning is a practice that still takes place all over the world, and of course there's the 21st century version, which is dumpster diving, a form of urban gleaning. Theft and poaching. And then when it comes to thinking of enterprise, we can see all the different kinds of business forms that exist alongside a classic capitalist enterprise. We have state-owned firms that could be seen as alternative capitalist, but they're owned by governments. We have firms that set themselves an agenda to be socially responsible or environmentally responsible, and therefore try and direct some of their profits into those activities, and of course non-profits. And of course all the many kinds of non-capitalist enterprises which you're very familiar with, worker cooperatives, community enterprises and social enterprises, but also sole proprietorship or self-employment, small business, and feudal and slave enterprise. So when we think about the diversity of property relations, we can also think of alternative private property, such as state-managed assets, clan or customary ownership, community land trusts, and all the vast amounts of property that or could be privatised or could be commoned, but at the moment is open access, such as the atmosphere, international waters, open source intellectual property. And lastly, for finance, we can think of all the alternative forms of finance that coexist with mainstream banks and financial institutions. Again, supposedly organised around something that's slightly a different kind of ethic than purely financial gain. And then all the other ways in which investment or forms of finance circulate in our society. Sweat equity, family lending, which is very important between generations, donations and interest-free loans. Okay, so as I said, these are the kind of motivations that we see with the capitalist growth machine. But what happens if we start to take back the economy and try and think about the different kinds of negotiations that take place around these kind of activities that could build different kinds of economies. So this is where we start to say we've got this inventory of diversity, this radically heterogeneous economic landscape. What is it that we'd like to strengthen? And this is where we try to think about what's a different kind of centering for questions of labour, questions of transactions, of business, of finance and property. So we could start to say, well, how do we survive? Why do we work? We work to survive. How do we survive? Do we survive well? What's necessary for human survival? And we can't really separate that now from saying what's also necessary for the survival of the earth, of Earth others. How can we do this? How can we work together and have a different kind of set of relationships to work that help us survive well? How can we think about the generation of wealth, and particularly the generation of surplus and its distribution within different kinds of contexts, and which are the contexts in which that distribution of surplus is actually going to enrich social and economic and environmental health? When it comes to thinking about transactions, what are the relationships that we have with other people, distant people and other environments that help to satisfy our needs? And how can we encounter those others in ways that support their well-being as well as others? You know, any complex economy is going to have some kind of transactional relationships across space, but do they need to be ones in which we're very cold in our relationship with where that, you know, today I sat eating my breakfast and realised the pear I was eating came from Argentina. I had absolutely no sense of what were the conditions under which that pear had been created or grown, what was the environmental conditions. Somehow I've been brought up to think it's okay to eat a pear at this time of the year in Montreal, you know. Why is it that we do that? And what are the ethical relationships that we're either ignoring or that could be activated through those kind of transactional relationships? And again, when it comes to thinking about property, we might shift the terms of reference to think about what is it that we do to maintain and replenish the gifts of nature and intellect that all humans rely on? And how can we start to care for our natural and cultural commons by commoning? Lastly, how do we invest our wealth and what do we put it in? And how can we invest in the futures that generations can live in well? So these are the kind of shift in focus and a shift of focus that I think are part and parcel of building a community economy. And of course, across all of those issues, we have to think about consumption and what do we use up and consume in the process of satisfying our needs. How can we consume more sustainably within all of those realms, as workers, as consumers, as property, in relation to property and so on. So, unlike the very structurally configured economy with its regularities and lawful relationships, the community economy is an acknowledged space of social interdependency and self-formation that centres on these kinds of concerns. So, here I'm quoting from a post-capitalist politics. The community economy is an acknowledged space of social interdependency and self-formation. It's not a blueprint. It's an unmapped and uncertain terrain that calls forth exploratory conversations and political and ethical acts of decision. And I guess that's really what we're here to discuss over the next few days. What kind of spaces of interdependency are we creating here, and what kind of selves do we need to become to be able to participate in a community economy? And I guess this refers back to the arguments that we made in a post-capitalist politics, that the politics we're talking about is not just a politics of language and reframing, which the diverse economy is. It's a let's have a different language of economy. But it's also a politics of the self, of the subject. What does it take to be a subject subjected to very different kinds of relationships than those ones that I put up to begin with? Very hard. And then what kind of politics of collective action do we get involved in, which is what all of you are already doing. Okay, so up till now I've talked about reframing economic identity, looking at the radical heterogeneity of economic activities that coexist, and that range, that heterogeneity and diversity could also be taken up into the realm of what is seen as capitalist economy and workplace relations and so on. But at the moment I've just tried to sketch out the things that might be seen as underneath the waterline. And how do we start to reframe economic dynamics, not around these kind of mechanistic relationships or hydraulic relationships, but around the notion of ethical interaction? Okay, so what I want to do then is talk about the kind of tools that we've developed in Take Back the Economy to try and guide this action. And of course, one of the tools is inventory, as I've laid out. But we also try and move on to kind of other kinds of metrics that help us look at our interdependency in new ways. So, let's see. In the first case, the technique of reading for economic difference, which is what we called looking for economic difference, is the first one, and then developing metrics of interdependence is the second step. Okay, so let me just think about these are just some of the kind of images in the book that I'll come to explain. These are some of the very down-home representations of little metrics you can use. Okay, so let's think about when we reframe labour and work in terms of community economy concerns. And here we're wanting to focus on the question of how do we survive well together with each other and the earth. And we ask, how is it that we're trading off different survival needs, of our own survival needs, those of others, and those of the earth, in the kinds of ways in which we're working? So the first step is just to do a very simple kind of time use analysis of the different kinds of labour that we're involved in, for instance, over the last 24 hours. And here's an example of the work profile of an Australian coal miner who works a 12-hour shift, working as paid work. He has travel to work and a bit of recreation and rest, but basically all of his work is up in that top box, wage labour. It's the kind of wage labour that is exorbitantly rewarded, but its cost is huge. It certainly buys allegiance to the fossil fuel industry, which is certainly the case for most Australian miners. But it's also a kind of work profile that leads to ill health, to family breakdown, and to the dysfunction of mining towns, because most people are flying in and flying out into these places to work for very concentrated periods, a sort of work profile that I think many people in Canada also share in. That's a very kind of a monocultural work profile if you look at it. It's just one thing. If you look at the work profile, this is the kind of, years ago I did research in mining communities with women who are reacting to the changes in roster that were allowing men to work. In that case, it was 7-day rosters where their weekends disappeared and, life of the community just also fractured. And really it was the tip of the kind of wedge that then led to 12-hour shifts and basically people moving away from mining towns and living on the coast. And this incredible social infrastructure that had been developed by governments and by private companies to build company towns is now almost a ghost town. They're just full of dongers for single men to fly in and fly out. Very, very, a real disaster in terms of regional development, to say the least. But here's the kind of profile of a Filipino farmer and the kind of communities that I've done action research, where farmers are largely tenant farmers, so they work for the landlord and get a payment in rice every year, so they get paid in kind, and mostly they will also pick up a bit of paid work, like working as a labourer at the port. And of course, they'll also be involved in a lot of unpaid work, such as reciprocal labour exchange when harvest time comes, and work in the community, bayanihan it's called in the Philippines, where you do other work for other people, helping build their houses and so on. There's time for recreation, there's time for rest. So all of us have quite different connection or mixes of the kind of work we do. Academics are probably a lot more like the Australian coal miner. Unfortunately. But community sector people might be putting together lots of different kinds of work to make a living. What kind of well-being then comes out of that kind of labour profile? And here we're using the research that's been done to show that well-being has to be divided into different kinds. There's just material well-being. How much do you have that can meet basic needs? There's the satisfaction you get from your work, what occupational well-being you have. There's the social well-being that comes from having close personal relationships and a supportive social network. There's the well-being that comes from being involved in community activities. And there's, of course, physical well-being, the health that you get from the kind of work profile you have. And work that I've done with women in Colombia who have used this kind of mechanism say, yeah, we want to add in their spiritual well-being as well. It's a kind of different dimension. It's not really represented in a lot of the more social science research on well-being. But if we use that as a simple kind of mechanism to say, well, what is it that we're doing with our kind of portfolio of work forms, the paid and unpaid labour time? How is it balancing off with time for life and time for well-being? And here we could get people to fill in a simple scorecard. And so for the Filipino the Filipino farmer, their material well-being in terms of actual material resources is quite poor. One is poor. Their community involvement and social connection is quite high, level 3. Physical well-being is just medium, but partly because of the lack of medical resources and health centres and so on in the context in which he's living. Now, that's a way of kind of bringing it back to thinking, well, why are we working? What kind of mix of work practices are we engaged in, and what kind of well-being is it creating? But what about the earth? And the earth. How is the well-being of this kind of work profile reflected in our ecological footprint? What kind of footprint is enabled by that kind of work-life balance? And here you can just do the simple kind of ecological footprint, which again is a somewhat problematic metric, but it allows you to start to gauge how many worlds would it take if everybody did the kind of work I do for the kind of remuneration I have and the kind of goods and services that I acquire. So when we kind of put together these two forms of surviving, we can see that, for instance, if we expand just pretend that our 24-hour clock is now a world, and we expand it to think of how many planets it would take for everybody to live the way that the Australian coal miner does, and the average ecological footprint in Australia is about 3.5 planets. I think for a coal miner it would be a lot more because the kind of expenditure these guys get involved in, mainly guys, some women too, a few cars, a few boats, a few things to make yourself feel better for this horrible kind of work-life balance that you have, would be much higher than that. If you think of the average in the Philippines is 0.7 planets, and that's largely because of the rural population, where probably their consumption would be much less, and that the ecological footprint of Danilo would be even less than that, than 0.7 of a planet. So who's living within their planetary boundaries? Why are we working to actually just eat up the world in the way we are? So it's this kind of exercise in self-inventory and comparison. And if we were to start to do that in groups of people as a prelude to starting to build a different future, we really have no idea what would emerge. But we do know that there are many kinds of collective actions that we can point to in which different groups are securing better livelihoods for themselves and others. And so here we're moving from the idea that you can inventory, you can start to look at these interconnections, and we can start to think of all the collective actions that are out there that are trying to work on helping people to survive well in more ethical ways. And of course, one of the biggest ones is the work on minimum wages, how it is that so many people who are working for wages can't even survive well because of the low level of the minimum wage, particularly in the US and other parts of the world. So the kind of collective actions are working on bringing that wage level up so that people can actually survive. Other kinds of strategies are actually redefining how much we need to live. The whole voluntary simplicity movement saying, why do we need so much stuff? Can we scale back, live differently? Can we have a shorter working week and still work and still survive well? And there's many movements that are trying to argue for this kind of reduction in at least paid labour time, so that there is time for other kinds of activities. There's also direct input by governments in helping to spread the burden of survival through things like provision of public goods. And in some cultures that's much higher than in others. But the public provision of public goods equalises the need to, and I guess reduces the need to earn so much more in order to live well. If there's adequate public transport that's cheap, if there's other kinds of health services and so on. And of course there's also the struggles that are going on to provide for survival needs directly, whether it's building housing or providing food directly. I've just been in Detroit where huge numbers of people are involved in urban farming to create self-provision their own food. And in other cases, and this is a picture of the bush care site that I work in irregularly, but as much as I can given my work-life balance, where we are working on trying to care for the bushland environment within Sydney, which makes everybody's life more pleasant. It actually reduces the heat island effect in the city. And of course allows other species to, particularly the native species, to survive. So I guess what I'm trying to illustrate here is how a language of community economy helps us to marshal these different kinds of politics into a kind of meshwork that potentially could be seen as starting to transform the world, particularly transforming how we survive well together. And of course, that's just one step, and it's a very personalised way of thinking about things. But we could also undertake these kinds of exercises with all the other kinds of dimensions of the economy. So the strategies are, first, differentiate and inventory and become sensitive to diversity. Second, reframe those relationships in terms of ethical concerns and become sensitive to the ethical interconnections that are embedded in the kind of transactions and work relations and enterprise relations we're involved in. Third, place human-human interactions and human non-human interactions alongside each other and start to explore our responsibility to each other, to future others, and to earth others. And then fourth, isolate the place that ethical decisions are made and decide on the kind of actions that we can support. So in each case, I don't want to go on for too long, but I'll try and just briefly give you some illustrations of how we might start to think about taking back markets, taking back business and property. And here I'll go a little bit quickly, but I think you've got the basic kind of framework for the techniques that we've developed here. Okay, so thinking about markets here or transactions, we're really trying to reframe them in terms of how do we encounter others. I mean, that's what markets are. They're places to encounter others, and of course, many other transactions are much more face-to-face. So how can we begin to identify our geographies of proximate and distant interconnection? And again, we can inventory the different kinds of goods and services that we acquire through the different kinds of transactions we're involved in, and classify them in terms of their diversity on a kind of diverse economy dandelion. So here's just an attempt to look at the goods that are in your house, or my house: electronics, clothing and footwear, food. Where have they come from? Where are the domestic connections? Where are the majority world connections? Where are the minority world connections? How much do we know about the conditions under which, and these are commodities that are being traded in the regular market. How much do we know about these? Where they've come from? What are the conditions, the environmental and social conditions under which they're created? But of course, many of the interactions we're involved in, transactions, aren't just market ones. So if you think about the humble tomato, what are the different kinds of interactions or transactions that you're involved in to procure tomato products? It could be tomato puree from Australian farmers, tomato paste from Thailand, where you have no idea what the environmental conditions are, or from Italy. But then, of course, there's the sort of reciprocal transactions that might take place during summer with community-supported agriculture, with friends and family, bartering from backyard production, and gifting. So there's many different ways in which our needs are being met. Goods and services are being created by different kinds of transactions. And in some cases we know a lot about where they've come from and the conditions under which they're created, but in other cases we don't. And of course this is where much of the interesting consumer activism has been focused in the last few years, trying to ask who are the people and the planetary environments in which the goods and services that we're drawing on are coming from, and to what extent are those kind of conditions ethically negotiated? To what extent is there adequate wages being paid to people? To what extent is there environmental health in these environments? So we can have a kind of interconnection checklist that helps us look at and it could be quite exhausting to do that for everything that you consume, but it's a way of starting to see how we as individual consumers are already connected out into the world in so many ways. And of course there's plenty of activism around fair trade and other kinds of relationships to increase the ethical nature of those interconnections. And this is the work of one of the artists I've had something to do with, Kate Rich, who has a whole movement called feral trade, which is a slight kind of criticism of fair trade, where she tries to market coffee using artists travelling around the world, and on each coffee pack she has every transaction that's gone into the production of that bit of coffee. Okay, I have 5 minutes left, so I probably cannot go in great detail here. I think many of you are interested in alternative enterprise forms where we need to think of the way in which wealth is being created and distributed, and here we use the idea of surplus, very key to kind of Marxian political economy, but I think it's not just surplus value, but it's also surplus labour that's being developed and appropriated and distributed in different kinds of enterprises. But there are many places in which there are ethical decisions that can be made in certain enterprise forms, where we can actually ethically negotiate how much money is going back to the workers for survival needs, how much is going to just keeping the business going, how much is going to some kind of collective wealth that might be distributed both within that enterprise but beyond to the community or to the environment. And there's a lot of interest these days in the role that worker-owned cooperatives can play in this kind of economy where human greed isn't placed at the centre of the business, but there's a collective benefit that is really watched and monitored and measured, and work in the solidarity economy is happening to try and build the connections between those kinds of enterprises all over the world. There's also interest in employee ownership and in social enterprise, which I'm sure we're going to talk more about later. And commoning I probably won't get to talking about, but here I guess we're thinking about all the different kinds of property that we move through during the day, but asking ourselves how much of that property is actually commoned? Where is it that we actively share access, we negotiate the kind of use of this property, we distribute the benefit widely, we take care and take responsibility for that property. And in our inventory, we sort of see people doing this with a whole range of different property types. So we're not matching commons only with public property. We're saying private property the property relations are one thing, but the relationships we have around that can also lead to a different kind of use, and commoning is one of them. So we talk about different ways of commoning, including enclosing, de-enclosing or deprivatising, but also showing how people are already commoning. And this is a map from the work of Kevin St. Martin, who's worked with fishing communities off the northeast of the US, where fishers actively common the seafloor. They actually arrange how they're going to fish in these zones and actively kind of monitor and share the benefit from their fishing grounds. And this is something that they kind of practiced but didn't really see in this way, and that's had a huge impact on fishing policy in the region. These are the kind of commoning activities taking place in places like Paris, where new commons are being created, old roads are being recolonised by recycling workshops, spaces are being taken over, and it's not without struggle. I'm about to visit this agro-city where the municipality politics has just changed from socialist to kind of right-wing, and they want to build a temporary car park now on this wonderful eco-city that's been developed. Okay, I was going to talk about commoning the atmosphere, an open resource, which of course Montreal played a big role in terms of the Montreal Protocol, where we as a nation, as a world, actually came together to agree to stop producing CFCs and start to mend the ozone hole. There are ways in which I think commoning practices are taking place in lots of different ways. So to conclude, in 2 minutes, I want to just lastly touch on what role we might play as academics, and not all of us are academics here, in this whole scene of thinking about post-capitalism. How can we think about our work as a form of political practice? The work of Latour is interesting here, because what he says is that what we do, potentially as commentators on the world, is extend the range of entities at work in the world and actively participate in transforming some of them. And he's really talking about transforming them into faithful and stable intermediaries. And he's more or less looking at the kind of dominant structures. But I'm interested in non-dominant structures. So whilst economists have been kind of describing the economy for many years, what they've been doing is kind of revealing and almost performing certain kind of calculative abilities in actors. This idea that we want more for less, this kind of rational, self-interested behaviour. Making sure that those kinds of competencies are sunk into common sense through many kind of practical tools, how we set up banking, property rights, cash registers, plugins, all these kind of technologies that basically help us perform a particular set of motivations and make things common sense. So what we're trying to do in Take Back the Economy is really trying to reveal different abilities, different ethical abilities. They might still be calculative, but they're motivated by different kinds of values in actors who maybe didn't know that they had them before. So we're trying to find ethical actions all over the world in all sorts of practices and try to make sure that some of these new competencies are sunk into common sense through a new set of practical tools. And that's really what those kind of little mechanisms were. They're kind of attempts to try and say, how do we start to make community economies a more commonsensical thing that we can achieve in many different ways. So thank you very much.
Hello. Thank you. That was an extremely invigorating and beautiful morning exercise we just did. Thank you very much. You rushed through the last bits, and I just want to pick up an idea and ask you a question. So I don't want to get all theoretical, but at the end then, what you seem to be suggesting is that we're going to try and use Michel Foucault's biopower and build a set of tools and practices that will transform. Can you respond to that?
Yeah, I think that's part of what we need to do. Yeah, I think so. I think I'm interested. Is that buzzing? Yeah. I am interested in us going beyond just discursive, narratives, to think more technically about what are the kind of technical apparatus that could produce a counter-governmentality. I mean, I think what's often overlooked in Foucault's work is the interest in not just looking at how the dominant forms of governmentality, but what would constitute counter-governmentality, and what kind of techniques and metrics might be part of that. I mean, that's just one part of our work, and I guess as we've been more influenced by the notion of a kind of assemblage politics rather than that this is part of and parcel of what making things more durable will be. There's been centuries of experimentation with what we might call community economies. Why is it that they haven't been able to kind of cohere into something that's more durable? Why is it that every generation has
almost.
Every generation has to rediscover these things? So what are the institutions? What are the technologies of those things?
Yeah, thank you. I think we're turning Foucault on his head. I love it.
Yes.
Okay, so go ahead.
Yeah, hello. Thank you. First of all, it was a really interesting talk. I just have one question in regards to the fact that you're trying to change the discourse that is used to talk about, so less about a Marxian structural political economy. And so I was kind of surprised by your use of the word infantry, which kind of reminds of a more class struggle, a Marxian idea. So could you maybe comment on that?
Inventory. Okay.
Infantry.
Oh, it wasn't infantry.
Oh, okay.
No, that's a military term.
Yeah, that's why.
Yeah, no, inventory.
That's Australian English.
Is it Australian English? Sorry. What would you say? Inventory.
Inventory.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. Yeah.
Inventory.
Well, okay. Well, then we're on the same page.
Yeah. I think we're okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
Sorry.
Hello. Thank you very much for the excellent presentation, extremely enlightening. I have a broad question that I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to respond here, but looking at, I've been following your work since a post-capitalist economy, and I was also following some other works that are very similar to yours, for example, Eric Olin Wright's or Michael Albert. So I was wondering, how do you guys relate to each other? How do you guys compare your works? Because sometimes it seems kind of parallel works. They're not, communicating as much as they could have been communicating to each other. Or how do you differentiate your work from Paracon or Real Utopias?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Ethan might be able to help on this one too. I mean, I could make a quick comment. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Eric invited us to come to talk at the Haven Centre, and before the end of Capitalism came out, or just after, and he wanted to have nothing to do with it. Like, this is ridiculous. Like, that's what most people thought when we first wrote that, the end of capitalism. And it was the post-structuralist kind of interest in discourse, I think, that he didn't like at all. He was still into the class fractions and doing this big global study of how everyone is fitting into which class fraction and all this kind of thing. So now, of course, he's totally on side. He's come around. He still has boxes. Are we transforming capitalism or are we doing something? So capitalism's still a big term in his vision, I think. He's coming from a different kind of sociological tradition that's been less influenced by the feminist post-structuralism that we've been. But in the end, a lot of the things he advocates are similar. I I do worry that there's a little bit of a blueprint kind of aspect to his work, and potentially to Alperovitz as well, which is saying, well, okay, that's fine, that's the vision, but how on earth are we going to get there? So we've always been interested in this idea of starting where we are, starting with the affects, the political affects, the involvements, and trying to figure out how do we actually move to these kinds of visions, many of which have the same elements, worker cooperatives or participatory democracy or other things. So there's a slightly different genealogy of thinking, and but maybe Ethan can step in here because he's been more involved with Gar's work too.
Well, yeah, I think it's a challenging relationship to think about, on one hand, this work that's trying to imagine what the next big system's going to look like. That work tends to want to think about the economy as a thing and sort of as a system. And I think the community economies approach, I think it can be confusing because we're using the same word, economy, but in community economy, that word actually doesn't mean a thing, it means a process. So, if we think about breaking down the word economy into the eco, the oikos, the home, and the nomi, which is the nomos, which is sort of the management or negotiation of the home, it's a very different thing to think about, what's the next economic system going to look like versus how do we actually enact new kinds of negotiation over our shared home? What does it mean to be building this home right now? The blueprint approach, I want to say that it's important as a motivator for helping us to imagine in the distance. In the way that Eduardo Galeano would talk about, what is utopia for? It is for walking. But it can really quickly become this kind of contest between, various different people who all think they've got the next thing figured out. And then if I think about the kind of politics that come out of that, it's a politics where we either convince everyone that our system is the one, or we have to take state power and impose our system on everyone. So for me, I want to practice a radical democratic politics, and that model sort of approach doesn't help me do that. So thinking more in terms of how do we assemble different economic practices from the ground up, to me is how we are going to embody a much more radically democratic way of thinking.
Alors, juste un petit point d'animation, puisque nous sommes aussi dans une optique d'aplanir les relations de pouvoir dans la prise de parole, j'inviterai Lorraine à parler au micro. On va faire une alternance homme-femme, ainsi qu'une alternance premier et deuxième prise de parole.
Je vais parler en français. Ça va?
It's fine.
D'accord. Merci, Madame Gibson. C'était super intéressant. J'aurais 3 questions. La première, peut-être parce que je n'ai pas tout à fait bien compris en anglais. Une grande partie de toutes ces expériences-là dont vous parlez peuvent aussi être interprétées comme des tentatives pour réformer le capitalisme. Alors, comment éviter de tomber dans des formes de réformisme, dans le fond, en faisant les mêmes choses? On pourrait y revenir aussi dans la discussion de la journée. Ma deuxième question, vous avez peu parlé de démocratie. Dans les critères ou les indicateurs des expériences en vue d'une économie, des communautés, quelle place faites-vous au processus de démocratisation, au processus de règlement des conflictualités qu'il y a toujours au sein des communautés? Et troisièmement, qu'est-ce que vous entendez par communauté?
I'll take a stab and then you can take a stab. Thank you. I guess let me start with the end first, with community, because, I think the term community is a very freighted and difficult term, and we've made a choice to use it, even though it would be easy to abandon it because it's so associated with things that people all think they know what it is. So the term community is often associated with locality, with people who kind of know each other, they're all the same, they have the same interests, and we're not using that strain of thinking when we talk about the community. We're really relating to the work of the French theorist Jean-Luc Nancy, who's talked about the idea of community as the being in common, again, the process, the practice of being in common. That there's no such thing, we don't know what a community is until we're thinking about the kind of action that's involved in being in common. We're all born into a world where we're born into sociality, where we're always interdependent on others for our living. And that's the core, that's his kind of almost ontological starting point, rather than as individuals, you know. So how do we then live with that kind of being in common? And what does it mean to create community in any way, any kind of sphere? So the economy is a place where a certain kind of being in common can be negotiated, like Ethan was just talking about. How do we know that we're not just reforming capitalism? I don't think we do, but if we start with the idea that everything isn't capitalism, that there are practices here that get discursively kind of framed as a coherent system, and, you know, violences that go along under the name of capitalism for sure. But if we don't start from that point of view, then I think it gives us more action, more room to move. If we don't adopt what we call a capitalocentric view, where everything that we see is either capitalism or the same as or about to be capitalism or the opposite of, but therefore in relationship to. And here we're bringing on feminist thinking that's been developed around phallogocentrism, the way in which woman was always positioned around this master signifier man. So you could never have a sense of what woman was except in relation to man. We've brought that into the economy to think that we don't want to see every economic activity as always already capitalist or on the way to being capitalist. And if we don't, then I think there's more room to move. And of course, how power dynamics get worked out in all these contexts is something that needs to be continually assessed to show whether who's benefiting, you know, whether it's just still the 1% or a certain class or others. So this is developing our techniques of analysis that will help us decide, is this just not transforming anything, or is it just kind of reproducing something? But I guess it's always going to be work. Where democracy fits with our work, I think, is underdeveloped, but it's very central to the idea that ethical negotiation has to be done democratically. And what does that actually mean in practice is going to mean a lot of different things. Is it one person, one vote? How does a group decide what is a democratic practice? And that, again, has to be something that is part of the negotiation. But all the collective actions that we're interested in, I think, are ones that try and enhance democratic practice, even though that it's a sort of problematic term in some ways, the way democracy has been defined in Western thinking about individualism and so on. So I think it's an area for more development for us, but I'll turn it over to Ethan. Might have thought more about the democratic stuff or not? Yeah, let's move on to another.
En fait,
you can add in later. Maybe you can answer the next one.
Merci, Catherine. En fait,